Welcome to today's webinar on the value of forensics. We want to thank everyone watching today from the United States as well as our international colleagues. We are expecting a truly global audience today to include participants from Latin America, Africa, Europe, and Asia. Thank you for taking your time to join us today, especially during these challenging times. Today's webinar is being hosted by the United States Department of Justice's International Criminal Investigative Training Assistance Program, also known as ICITAP. My name is Mark Mogul. I am the Assistant Director for Forensics at ICITAP, and I am joined here in Washington by our Senior Forensic Advisor, Brittany Graham, and our Curriculum Development Specialist, Dave Snodgrass. For those not familiar with our office, ICITAP is one of DOJ's international focused offices. We provide international development assistance that supports foreign policy objectives. ICITAP works in close partnership with the U.S. Department of State and the U.S. Agency for International Development. ICITAP works with foreign governments to develop professional and transparent law enforcement institutions that protect human rights, combat corruption, and reduce the threat of transnational crime and terrorism. ICITAP provides assistance across the law enforcement spectrum, from community policing to corrections, to address a diverse set of issues, including gender-based violence, human trafficking, and cybercrime. While forensic science is critical to these investigations, we also believe that forensic science is a key component to the rule of law by improving public trust through evidence-based prosecutions. To date, ICITAP has assisted over a dozen countries achieve international accreditation of their forensic laboratories. Today, we want to explore the added value that forensic science can provide. We have an excellent panel assembled. With us today is Dr. Jennifer Doliak from Texas A&M University, Dr. Paul Speaker from West Virginia University, and Mr. James Anderson from the RAND Corporation. Each will add a unique perspective on our work in forensic science and the added value we can bring to the criminal justice system. We plan to have some time for questions at the end. So as Dave mentioned, if you have any questions for the panel, please post them in the chat. So let's get started today with our first speaker, Dr. Jennifer Doliak, who will be speaking to us today about the impact of DNA databases on crime. Dr. Doliak is an assistant professor of economics at Texas A&M University and director of the Justice Tech Lab. Dr. Doliak studies crime and discrimination with focuses on how to reduce recidivism and the effects of technology on public safety. Dr. Doliak organizes the Texas Economics of Crime workshop and an online seminar on the economics of crime. She also hosts Probable Causation, a podcast about law, economics, and crime. Prior to Texas A&M, Dr. Doliak was an assistant professor at the University of Virginia's Patton School of Leadership and Public Policy. Dr. Doliak holds a BA in economics and mathematics from Williams College and a PhD in economics from Stanford University. Welcome, Dr. Doliak. Thank you for joining us today, and the mic is yours.
Great. Thank you so much for having me. I'm looking forward to all the discussion. So my work focuses really on trying to measure the effects of different technologies in the law enforcement space on criminal behavior. So I'm going to present some work I've done recently on the effects of DNA databases on the deterrence and detection of offenders. And this is joint work with Anne-Sophie Anker and Rasmus Landerstow, both at the Rockwell Foundation in Denmark. So the question that we're trying to answer here is, does DNA profiling deter criminal behavior? So the use of DNA databases, as this audience certainly knows, as well as other similar high-tech tools, is expanding around the world. And the main way that we think that they should work is by increasing the probability of getting caught, instead of increasing the punishment. So instead of focusing on putting, someone who commits murder in prison for twice as long, using forensics tools like this will increase the likelihood that we catch someone in the first place. that they're held accountable. So these tools have a lot of potential, but they do fall in the bucket of interventions that a lot of people think of as surveillance, and so they bring privacy costs that concern a lot of people. And I think citizens understandably want to know what they're getting in exchange for this privacy. So in this paper, we consider the effects of DNA databases on recidivism in Denmark using the timing of a massive database expansion in that country as a natural experiment. So the question we're trying to answer here is, what are the effects of DNA databases on the individuals in the database? So there really isn't a whole lot of evidence on this type of question. So I had previous work using data from the United States, looking at the effects of adding people who are convicted with different types of felony offenses to criminal databases in the U.S. And found that people who were added to the database using a very similar strategy as what I'm going to describe here reduced the probability of subsequent convictions by 17% for those who had been convicted of a violent felony in the past, and about 6% for those convicted of property crimes in the past. The data in the U.S. are much more limited and very messy. I had to get data state by state, and there are a variety of concerns there. Denmark has much better data. It's in many ways a researcher's dream to work with Danish data. And the other reason that I think the Denmark experiment that I'm going to talk about is interesting is that the current policy frontier, at least in the U.S., is adding arrestees, not convicts. All states in the U.S. have databases that include everyone convicted of felonies, and so the question is, how do we expand, or is it worthwhile to expand past that? And so the Danish expansion helps us answer that question. So here's kind of the basic intuition of the natural experiment and how we're going to exploit it here. Imagine you have two identical offenders. One happens to be charged on May 24th and one happens to be charged on May 25th. The database expansion is going to go into effect on May 25th in Denmark. And so that means you've got two, otherwise identical people. The first person was charged just before. He does not go in the database. The second person is charged just after. He does go in the database. And so that means that when we see that the person on the left who is not in the database is more likely to wind up in prison later on, we can attribute that difference in subsequent behavior to the effect of the treatment that is being added to the database in the first place. So there wasn't any other underlying difference between these people. It was just sort of luck of the draw when precisely they got charged with their offense. I also want to say a little bit about what exactly we're measuring here. So one nice thing about this empirical strategy is that all other societal changes or changing practices in the criminal justice system, including a general increase in the collection and use of DNA evidence, in police, all of those changes are going to affect those charged just before and just after that policy change, so that May 25th change that I just described. So that's going to affect both people in the control group, the guy on the left, and people in the treatment group, the guy on the right. I think, again, this audience surely knows this, but a lot of other people do not. Police can get a warrant to obtain DNA from anyone identified as a suspect in a crime. So really what we're trying to measure here is the value add of being added to the DNA database. So being added to that DNA database increases the likelihood that someone is identified as the perpetrator in cases where they would not otherwise be a suspect. That's the effect that we're able to measure here. It's like, how much value does that add? Okay, so what happened in Denmark? Their DNA database was first established in 2000. At that time, it included only a very small number of offenders. So it included only those charged with very serious violent offenses, and DNA was only collected and added to the database if it was necessary for the current investigation. So that would exclude a whole lot of serious violent offenders, where DNA was not sort of the crux of the case. In 2005, there was a big expansion, and this is the expansion that we're going to use in our study, that added anyone charged with a crime punishable by at least 1.5 years in prison. So that's comparable to all felonies in the United States. And it also removed that requirement about relevance to the investigation. So it also is going to add some of those more serious violent offenders that would not have been included before. So this policy change is effective May 25th, 2005. As you'll see in the graphs that I show you next, one slightly complication here is that the summer holidays in Denmark are a real thing, and a lot of police officers were on vacation when this went into effect. So it meant the police department was severely understaffed during June through August. The implementation was a bit slow, but in general, the probability that a charged individual was added to the database increased from about 4% in April and May to about 40% by that October afterwards. So it really was a huge expansion of the DNA database in that country. So here's what that looks like. So you can see there's the probability of being added to the database is on the y-axis, and the month is on the x-axis. So you can see it's relatively a really pretty small number of people who were added to the database before, and pretty flat. And then the database expansion goes into effect where that red line is, and we see those gray dots are the summer months, which we wind up dropping in a lot of our analysis. And then we see this kind of leveling off by about October. Everyone who's supposed to be in there is in there. So that's the big jump that we're exploiting here. So we have data, the big benefit, again, of doing this in Denmark is we have amazing data. We have longitudinal criminal history data for the full country. This includes when an individual was added to the database, as well as the timing and details of all their future offenses and charges. We're going to focus on recidivism over 1 to 3 years from the date of the charge. What I'm going to show you today is just 1 year. We have more in the paper if anyone's interested. We drop anyone who doesn't reside in Denmark because we can't follow them over time. This is mostly tourists. Tourists, do commit a decent amount of crime, but they're certainly not the main concern. And we're also going to focus on young men. So men ages 18 to 30 at the time of their charge, because that's the group that is going to continue to commit the most crimes. They're the ones who are of biggest concern. In the paper, we also are able to link these data to a whole bunch of other information from the DNA, the Danish register. So marriage, residence, children, employment, education. We can see, beneficial changes on those different dimensions as well when people stop committing crime, as one might expect. But it's nice to be able to see that in the data. So we're going to use this instrumental variable strategy referred to as a regression discontinuity. The basic intuition here is is what I described before. The timing of the charge results in a big jump in DNA collection for those charged just after the policy change. So the question we're trying to answer here is, does that big jump in DNA collection result in a similar jump or drop in recidivism? As I said before, we're going to drop those summer months because we're worried about, who did make it into the DNA database when folks were on vacation. It might be sort of a weird sample, but everything really holds when we include the summer months too. So it's not really that big a concern. So here's what we find. We see this the effect on the probability of a new conviction within 1 year. So you can see it's, pretty flat and steady leading up to the policy change. It looks like, kind of remains flat and steady through those summer months. They're a little weird. And then we see this big drop. So the probability of a new conviction within 1 year falls 42% relative to the baseline for folks that were charged just before the policy change. So this is consistent with the idea that when people know that they're more likely to get caught for future offenses, they are deterred from committing more crime. We can do the same thing with the number of new convictions. We see a very similar effect, pretty flat, and then we see a big drop once those folks are the folks that are charged after the red line are the ones that go in the DNA database, and they recidivate at much lower levels. So we can dig into what's driving these effects, cut this across various subsamples to see really who's where we see the biggest benefits. I think the overall takeaway is we see benefits really for almost everyone. By initial charge type, we see, property offenders and violent offenders both reoffend at lower rates. First-time and repeat offenders reoffend at lower rates. The effects are bigger for first-time offenders, but are significant and large for both groups. By whether they had kids, other kinds of factors like that, we see declines. The one I've highlighted in yellow here is the one place we do see a pretty striking difference is by age. So those that are between 8, so our sample is 18 to 30. If we look at the lower half of that sample, so 18 to 23, basically they're driving our entire effect. The older group within that sample doesn't have any effect here. So this is kind of, I think, consistent with the idea that this kind of just, snaps people out of the bad track that they're on when they're relatively young and have the ability to course correct. So I think that's interesting and suggestive. I will note, we've run all these different subsamples, so the fact that we're seeing a difference on one of them is perhaps not surprising. So I think of this as suggestive evidence that it might be more useful for the young offenders. We also can look at which types of crimes are prevented going forward, and we see both a reduction in property and violent crimes going forward. So people, I think the story that I have in my mind about how this is working is that basically people say, well, I'm in the DNA database now, I need to stop hanging out with the guys that are always getting me into trouble, stop drinking so late, stop doing all the things that usually lead me to get into trouble, rather than thinking specifically, I'm not going to commit the particular crimes that might lead to DNA evidence. So in general, kind of forcing people to, or giving people an incentive to course correct and just sort of straighten up rather than deterring specific types of crimes. So overall, just to wrap up, what we're finding here is that adding someone charged with a felony offense to Denmark's DNA database reduced the probability of a subsequent conviction by 42% during the first year after the initial charge. The effects do persist for at least 3 years. At some point, the folks who are in our control group, the folks who were charged before the policy change, start cycling through the system, and they're gradually added to the DNA database too. So we can't look too far out, but we do see effects persist at least 3 years. The effects are largest for the younger offenders. That's interesting suggestive evidence that this deterrent effect can be the most useful for that group. And the deterrent effects are apparent for property and violent offenders and reduce both types of crime going forward. So there do seem to be big, widespread benefits of this kind of policy, which again are in line with what I found in the United States. But we're able to kind of more precisely measure big effects in Denmark when we have better data. Which is how it's supposed to work. So nice to be able to see it in practice. And that's it. I will leave it there. Thank you so much.
Right. Thank you, Dr. Doliak. Very, very interesting, especially for the scientists watching to have an economist sort of evaluate the impact of the work that we do. So next, we have Dr. Speaker. Dr. Speaker will be speaking to us today and sharing his management expertise on the topic of laboratory productivity and the return on investment in forensic science. Dr. Speaker is a faculty member at West Virginia University's Finance Department. He holds a PhD and master's from Purdue University and a BA from LaSalle College. Dr. Speaker holds the position of Chief Executive Officer of Forensic Science Management Consultants, LLC, a firm which specializes in the business of forensics using the forensics of business. Dr. Speaker is the principal investigator for Project Foresight, a business-guided analysis of forensic science laboratories. He serves as the technical consultant to the American Society of Crime Laboratory Directors for the Foresight 2020 project under a grant from the Laura and John Arnold Foundation. His research focuses on financial management in the public sector with an emphasis on the performance of forensic laboratories and public health laboratories. Beyond the development of general performance metrics for his laboratories, his focused research has reviewed laboratories' return on investment from testing sexual assault kits, laboratory contributions to the resolution of the opioid crisis, and the determination of forensic laboratory resource needs to meet justice system goals. Dr. Speaker, the mic is yours.
Thank you, Mark. Well, greetings to everyone. As Mark mentioned, I serve as the principal investigator for Project Foresight. And what I want to talk to you about is partly to follow up with what Dr. Doliak was showing with respect to the power of DNA databases in a couple applications that we have here, but to also take a look at when you're following your own data and you're able to relate that to the rest of the community of other forensic laboratories, just what power you can have, and particularly in trying to find the appropriate funding for some of your objectives. So we can begin with this very, very simple statement. Now, this comes from a 2015 publication by Browning, but it says resources are decreasing, and this is for crime laboratories. We must keep learning how to be more efficient in using ever-evolving forensics technologies and examining the actual justice outcomes resulting from forensic evidence so that limited resources can be used wisely. Now, this is a problem that is faced in every type of economic situation, that you're going to be balancing the limited resources that you have for a seemingly endless demand for those resources. And this is very, very true of the forensic laboratory. And looking at things, you have a lot of technologies that are really quite interesting. And It's the economic problem is that you've got so many cool things to be able to do, but you need to make choices, and you're going to have to be able to limit how you're going to be able to apply those and where they're going to be used. So we come from it from that standpoint in stressing that the management of every laboratory really has to understand not just the basic science that goes on there, but the economics that are involved and the decisions that you're making. So when you choose to do one thing, we refer to it in economics as an opportunity cost. That necessarily means you're not doing something else. So what do we want to be able to do here? We want to be able to give you the power to be able to inform your own policymakers with respect to your funding. So if you have this as decision makers in the laboratory, how do you determine how you're going to allocate your scarce resources? Because I've met very, very few, if any, laboratory managers that would say that they are funded to the greatest extent possible, that there isn't more that they might be able to do. We want to be able to, through our studies, be able to provide metrics that will permit comparison with other expenditure alternatives. So in the public sector, while you may be part of the justice system, you're also competing with things like roads and the arts and utilities or whatever might be provided in the public sector. So how do you argue why you get the funding rather than, at least in more importance than somebody else? One way to do that is to be able to turn things into an ROI, a return on investment, and to be able to talk about that at the level of whatever your jurisdiction is, to be able to make a reasonable argument as to why you need funds. And certainly with the limited resources that you have is to be able to put these to the highest use possible. So if you look over time at some of the things that a forensic laboratory might be doing, you'll notice that ultimately some activities and some types of case investigation might not be utilized simply because they've become way too expensive. And then how do we do this? Well, what is the benefit to society that you're going to get when you look at the alternative uses and try to put it and connect it to what the objectives of the laboratory might be? So how do we do this? Well, most of the studies that you see are going to be talking about the social benefits, but they only have a very, very brief insight into what the associated costs are. And what we've done in Project Foresight is we collect data not only on casework, but also on the financials and the allocations of those financials and the allocation of personnel. And one of the key things that we're able to find, whether it's from Project Foresight or the Census of Publicly Funded Crime Laboratories or estimates we make for any non-reporting laboratories, is that the costs are not the same, that there are some rather severe economies of scale involved. So if you happen to be a jurisdiction that has a low crime rate, a smaller population, your costs per case are going to be somewhat higher. And that's just the nature of very, very basic economics. So this is one example of how we've used this, and this is in testing the backlog of sexual assault kits. So Wang and Wine had a very important piece that came out in 2018, where what they did is they borrowed information from a variety of studies that were out there, and they used things like the relative frequencies that they found in terms of various outcomes to proxy as probabilities. They looked at what the costs are from a sexual assault. And so you find some rather amazing numbers here. So the average cost from a sexual assault, well over $400,000. And these costs come from a variety of forms. Certainly the survivor or the victim and what their costs were, but also about half of it coming from the avoidance expenditures. So what kinds of security expenditures come because of sexual assaults in a particular location. They used detail from a variety of studies, including New York City's sexual assault kit testing for Manhattan on their backlog, and some information on Detroit, and attempted to use in each case, the most conservative estimates that they could find from each of these and combining those. They looked at what you have from offenders is, what they found is that, for example, a serial rapist tended to operate over about a 3.5-year period with a mean average number of assaults at just over 7 per year. So they use this kind of information to come through to come up with what their estimates were on the value of testing that backlog. So in New York, for Manhattan, they tested 3,777 kits, found that 2,448 did not have any DNA available, but 1,329 did. Out of that group, 279 were already under arrest, 792, the statute of limitations had run out. 138, there was some problem with either the records or the assault victims or witnesses recanting or not being available. At the time of the presentation from Martha Bashford, there were 44 cases that had not been adjudicated. 29 cases were not conclusive, but out of all those tested, they had 47 convictions. Now, this does not suggest that convictions are the only outcome from testing evidence. Certainly, exoneration is a very, very important part of that. But they limited just to be able to say, hey, here's what the return on investment was from just those convictions. Now, what we did is in a study that we had in 2019 is we looked at it by jurisdiction. So those very small numbers over there are available in the publication, but it looks at your caseload versus what the return on investment would be. So if you can think of a return on investment, it says, what was the benefit you received? Okay, and a lot of this is cost avoided versus what was the cost of the testing. So you say, okay, well, that net benefit would be that difference. We look at that relative to the cost. So you see here that even at a very small caseload, you had a return on investment of well over 9,000%. And optimally, a laboratory that was somewhere in the low 6,000 caseload for DNA testing, that return on investment got as high as 50,000%. And that's about where you had perfect economies of scale. Testing levels beyond that, costs tended to go up, but you still find some very substantial returns. Now, what do we know here is that, well, because costs do differ, that there are economies of scale, what happens is that the return on investment for any individual laboratory can be measured, but then they can provide in a jurisdiction a justification for the testing that they're doing to say, well, what is your return on investment? And just to put this into perspective, if you consider a company that is on the Dow Industrials, for example, in the stock market, if you're talking about a return on investment that exceeds, 10%, you're thinking they're doing great. And we're talking about things almost as high as 50,000%. So it does give a very good measure to be able to compare to other uses of resources. So we do this for a variety of different projects. So currently we're looking at a project with cases of DUI drugs in states where there is legalization of marijuana to be able to try to measure those kinds of things. And we'll use things like Aldi Viscusi's value of a statistical life. So for example, in the case of drug driving or drunk driving, what is the cost of a fatality? And you get that from this value of a statistical life, that fatality well over $8 million. Injury alone, about $83,000. And even if it's just property damage, cost of $10,000. So what do we get by avoiding those? Well, in the case of some states where they've legalized marijuana, they've boasted of hundreds of millions of dollars in tax revenue. Yet the funding for toxicologists for the forensic lab. So it's to help provide the justification we would have there. We also talk about this from a sentinel laboratory emphasis. So even if you look at the last year and COVID-19 and what we had with that, what was the value to be able to provide greater funding to medical examiners, to be able to identify public health issues such as this. Likewise, we've looked at this for the opioid crisis and the various synthetics. How do you justify having more toxicologists and having them up to date on reference samples? If you look at the White House's Council of Economic Advisors under the prior administration, what they were showing is that the cost of the opioid crisis exceeds 2% of gross domestic product. So what happens when you can show the cost of it getting to the justice system versus putting funds into public health? And the benefits that we want to measure come not only from convictions, but exoneration, prevention, and so on. We use this data to complete this report to Congress on the needs assessment of forensic laboratories. So if you have a chance to use that, to look at that, we'll talk a little bit about this. But basically, the data shows that forensic laboratories in the United States at the state level, regional level, or metropolitan level, were short staffing by over 900 positions. So we've taken this and produced something called a workforce calculator project to be able to take this down to the individual laboratory level. And I encourage anybody to please visit the Forensic Technology Center of Excellence and try out the calculator. It'll give you an idea on what your jurisdiction has, and we'll show this in the coming slides. We use Project Foresight data, where we have over 200 forensic crime laboratories from fiscal year 2006 through 2020. We collect data on casework, expenditures, allocation of personnel. We also use U.S. Census population data and FBI crime data. In putting that together, we collect data from Project Foresight, which just asks some very basic things, and I'll encourage every laboratory listening to consider joining the project. There's no cost to you to join it, but we collect information on caseload, how many cases are input, and the full-time equivalent employment in each area of investigation. For the same areas of investigation, we collect information on your personnel allocations, and then laboratory-wide what we would have for capital expenditures, chemicals, reagents, other consumables, and then any other expenditure that you might have. And we look at this. So this is an example here on productivity. So on the left-hand side, we have cases per employee. And we look at that versus caseload. So you can see the data that we have estimated in here, and this is for blood alcohol testing, is we want to try to estimate what is, say, an efficient level of production. And the higher the caseload, the more productive we tend to see. It tends to peak at a certain point and then be downward sloped. And we use these estimates to go into the workforce calculator. So it only asks for a couple things: type of jurisdiction, populations for your state, or the jurisdiction you serve, and the largest city. And then there's just to indicate what kind of jurisdiction. If you put in the caseload, it'll immediately populate the optimal FTE. If you're able to also put in the current staffing of your laboratory, it'll tell you what the differences are. This is just an example for a 2 million state population with a 450,000 jurisdiction and 125,000 in the largest city. And you enter in, it immediately gives you a feedback. It also at the bottom tells what the associated capital expenditures would be to be able to maintain that activity. Just a couple comments here. I'd encourage any laboratory to try out the site. It's free to use. RTI International, through the Forensic Technology Center of Excellence, hosts this. We encourage feedback on what you've found out from this. Likewise, we invite everybody to join Project Foresight. In joining that, again, we don't charge anything for this, and this includes labs around the world are all invited to participate. We use the Foresight data, also recognize those that are the highly efficient laboratories. And again, as I said, as of this writing, there is no charge. And if you need more information, we certainly invite you to either contact me directly, there's my information, or to visit the Project Foresight website at the Chambers College at West Virginia University, or to go as well to the Forensics Technology Center of Excellence and try out the Workforce Calculator. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Speaker. Really interesting talk. I think everyone listening today is somewhat cost constrained, so very informative. Our next speaker today is Mr. Anderson, Mr. James Anderson, who will be speaking about the unrealized potential of forensic evidence. Mr. Anderson is Director of the Justice Policy Program and the Rand Institute for Civil Justice and Senior Behavioral and Social Scientist at the Rand Corporation. He has been the principal investigator on a wide range of projects ranging from policy implications of autonomous vehicle technology to understanding the effects of indigent defense systems. He has been funded by the National Institute of Justice, the National Institutes of Health, the Bureau of Justice Statistics, the State of Pennsylvania, the Institute for Civil Justice, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, the Department of Defense, and the National Science Foundation. His work has appeared in the Harvard Law Review, the Yale Law Journal, the Stanford Law Review, the Journal of Law and Economics, the Oxford University Press, and in numerous RAND publications. He has presented to a wide variety of audiences of academic and professionals. He is a member of the American Law Institute, and before joining RAND, he clerked for the Honorable Morton Greenberg of the United States Court of Appeals for the Third Circuit and practiced law for 10 years as an assistant federal defender representing death sentence prisoners. He received a JD from Yale Law School and a BA in Ethics, Politics, and Economics from Yale University. Mr. Anderson, the mic is yours.
Thanks, Mark. And for those who are unfamiliar, RAND's a nonprofit organization that's dedicated to improving policy through research and analysis. At any given time, we've got something between 50 and 70 projects dealing with either the civil or the criminal justice system or some aspect of it. Many funded through the generous support of some part of the Department of Justice. Also, we're funded through philanthropies and local municipalities and sometimes states. This was a fun project that was funded through the National Institute of Justice. The project team consisted of myself, a lawyer, and Carl Matthews, who's was a working forensic scientist, Sarah Greathouse, who's an experimental psychologist, and Amoavoil Chari, who's an economist. So it was an interesting interdisciplinary team that we were able to put together to look at a bunch of questions around how forensic science works both sort of in theory and in practice. So I want to talk a little about the significant promise of forensic science. And I'll start out with, and this has been realized for a long time. There was this terrific quotation from back in 1896 that I'll read. The darkened courtroom, the awed silence of the assembly, the intense mental strain on those most deeply interested, the awful force of the blow to the guilty man when he first beholds the evidence of his crime illumined by the light of scientific test. So this isn't a new idea that forensic science has a particularly powerful role to play in the criminal justice system. But to really sort of understand its potential, I think it also helps to really view the criminal justice system as a diagnostic system. And that forensic science can really prove to be an additional source of information that the system can use to avoid two particular types of error: wrongful convictions and unsolved cases. And the idea here is you're really viewing the system. And the criminal justice system has, of course, a host of constraints. and goals, but almost any coherent theory of the criminal justice system at least focuses on correctly and accurately identifying the guilty and minimizing unsolved cases. And James Doyle, among others, have really argued for the application of this set of error reduction concepts to the criminal justice system. So one way of thinking about this is this is called the Swiss cheese model of accident reduction. It's widely used originally in sort of industrial processes, but then has been adopted in aviation as well as in medicine now as a way to try to make a system resilient and robust to the inevitable human error. So you try to minimize the chance of having a bad outcome, recognizing that humans are going to make mistakes. And so there are a couple kind of key takeaways here. When you apply the sort of systems analysis to complex systems, you want independent screens. So accidents are more likely to occur if the different screens are mushed together and a problem can get through the independent screens. And the reason that forensic science is promising in theory is because it's objective and scientific. It's potentially the error rate of various techniques can be characterized more accurately, so that you might know that a particular forensic technique is accurate 90% of the time, as opposed to, say, eyewitness testimony or other forms of evidence that the criminal justice system uses. And uncorrelated errors are really important when you're trying to reduce the overall error rate of the system. And the forensic science process has at least the theoretical possibility of being relatively unconnected to the other kinds of evidence. So any errors that occur in the forensic science process hopefully aren't going to have anything to do with, say, an error of an eyewitness testimony or some error that somebody makes about where somebody is at a certain time. I do want to be really clear that and finally, yes, that the systems are loosely coupled, so that an error at one point isn't going to necessarily infect the subsequent systems. So I want to be really clear about the assumptions that underlie this fairly rosy model about the potential of forensic science. One, the evidence has to be genuinely scientific, and this is in some cases been pointed out to be a problem in some kinds of forensic evidence. First of all, there's often minimal peer review of some kinds of forensic science or well-characterized error rates. There has been sometimes things that have been called science that turned out to be based not on scientific fact, but more sort of habit. And so, for example, a bite mark evidence was used to convict a number of people. There were mismatching hair identification. And similarly, there was some arson investigation that turned out to be fairly unscientific. So that's an important assumption, that you're actually talking about accurate scientific evidence. You also have problems with lab scandals. So in some cases, you have to make sure that the forensic lab is actually doing what they're supposed to be doing. At least in the United States, there's a recurring, occasional but recurring problem with various lab personnel essentially falsifying results. And then occasionally you also get the problem of overstated results, where the person testifying at the trial dramatically or significantly misstates the results of the scientific analysis. So I want to be clear that these are all important underlying assumptions for the considerable potential for forensic science to be realized. And then the second sort of set of assumptions that are important is that it has to be genuinely independent and loosely coupled, so that the prosecuting officer or the investigating officer can't either influence the outcome of the forensic evidence, and also that the forensic evidence and the forensic scientists feel genuinely independent from the criminal justice process, and that they don't feel that their primary role is obtaining convictions, because there's a host of evidence that, even completely apart from outright fraud, that can influence their findings in ways that undermine independence and accuracy. Okay, well, so I've talked a little bit about how forensic science, the promise of forensic science in theory. How does it work in practice in the United States? There's somewhat of a sparse literature on this particular topic, but it's all fairly consistent. And the sort of the key takeaway from literature in the 60s, 70s, 80s is that it's not used very often, and even when it's readily available. And so one of the key questions, research questions we wanted to ask in this project was, has its use increased? Most of this earlier work occurred before widespread use of DNA, and frankly, we were hopeful that perhaps forensic science had sort of increased its role in the criminal justice system. I don't want to give you a spoiler, but it turns out that it really hasn't significantly increased. So what did we do? We did a mixed method study in 5 jurisdictions around the United States that varied both in size and geography. We did interviews with detectives, forensic labs, and prosecutors, and we collected a random sample of 1,000 reported crimes in each of the jurisdictions to determine the effect of forensic science on the outcome of the cases. And the crimes were from 2007 to 2009. We also did an analysis of the National Crime Lab data and an experimental survey of prosecutors and criminal defense lawyers to determine the effect of forensic science in plea bargaining, because of course that's where something like 95 or 97% of cases get resolved in the United States. I'll summarize our findings here. The interviews revealed that the development of the forensic evidence was not really independent of other kinds of evidence. The sort of the case status drove the analysis of forensic science and forensic evidence. So if there was no other evidence, there was little forensic testing. But if the case was going to trial, or there were other kinds of strong, say, eyewitness testimony or other kinds of evidence, it made it far more likely that forensic evidence was going to be developed. So, in some ways, the causality of what we thought we were going to find was somewhat reversed. It wasn't that the strong forensic evidence was then driving subsequent investigation. It was sort of the other way around, that other kinds of investigation were then driving the development of forensic evidence. I'm not going to walk through this table, but sort of the high level summary. This is to look at how often forensic evidence is collected and analyzed. It varies widely by jurisdiction and by crime. The range of analysis ranged from a high of 83% to a low of 19%, with generally more testing in homicides. But there's substantial variation even in homicides. So where you might think there was some sort of widespread best practices, but one of the takeaways of our study was really that those best practices really haven't emerged, even in situations in large jurisdictions where you might think there would be sort of a more or less set of standards for forensic evidence in high-profile cases. So this chart looks at what stage the forensic analysis occurred, and sort of consistent with what we found in our interviews. There was very little testing prior to arrest, relatively small amounts of testing prior to plea bargaining, slightly more testing prior to trial, but it was still relatively minimal. The analysis is again rarely occurring prior to arrest, and often not analyzed till the eve of trial. And so the kind of the takeaway here is that the additional informational advantage of forensic science is not really being utilized. And so it's not being utilized by detectives to identify additional suspects, or even to test their sort of initial premises, at least until it gets to trial. And of course, this reduces the independence of forensic science, or potentially can, if an inconsistent result will lead to a lost case. And so there's at least some implicit pressure on forensic scientists to ensure that their theory is consistent with the prosecutions. The other sort of takeaway, this is a slide about how long the analysis is taking and the average analysis time in days. So all these times are relatively great. So in hair testing, 237 days in Allegheny County in Pittsburgh, quite significant turnaround times, which is a key part of the story in terms of why the testing is occurring so late in the process. There's really a need for a triage, and so the testing that occurs late in the process because those are the cases with the highest priority, the ones that are about to go to trial. So really, it comes down to one of the things that Dr. Speaker noted, which is a shortage of forensic lab resources, and so there's a triage process that is required. And forensics were really viewed as a means of strengthening already strong cases. Another sort of interesting finding that came out of the interview process is that a lot of the prosecutors didn't view the forensics testing as a means of generating relevant probative material information. They really viewed it more as a means of addressing unrealistic jury expectations, so that jurors they thought expected forensic science and forensic evidence, and they felt obligated to test forensic evidence just for that fact, rather than any hope of presenting and strengthening their case. Okay, so I want to compare now what our findings to sort of the theoretical benefits. So it's rarely being used to identify suspects. It's rarely being used even in charging. In the relatively rare cases, it's being used at all. It's often being used to meet unrealistic jury expectations, and it potentially creates incentives for misconduct. So it's not serving, at least in our findings, that independent check, that sort of decoupled check that can prevent errors of both unsolved cases and wrongful convictions, the way we found that it was being used. The other parts of our study, the lawyers do agree that forensic evidence really matters to plea bargaining. Our experimental survey of both defense attorneys and prosecutors found that the stronger the forensic evidence, the more likely that the prosecutors would recommend longer sentences, and the more likely the defense counsel would recommend to their clients that they accept the longer sentences. So there were sort of correlations in the expected direction there. And then interestingly, we found in terms of forensic lab efficiency that the fee-based laboratories seem to have higher productivity. And then similarly, the laboratory management systems were also associated with increased productivity. Really, for both these, we can't rule out reverse causality for these, and that rather than the fee-based structure or the laboratory management system driving the increased efficiency, it was more that there was some other factor that was correlated both with the fact that they're using a fee-based system and the laboratory management system. Okay, so takeaway conclusions. The theoretical promise of forensic science really still remains largely unrealized. There's the sort of limited and late use of forensic evidence in the criminal justice process undermines some of the key theoretical benefits of the additional independence and the additional information that is a key potential of forensic science. And then quicker turnaround times in forensic labs are probably a necessary condition for earlier use of the forensic evidence. And then also fee-based labs appear to have greater productivity and also might lead to a more efficient triage system. So that's it. Thank you very much. I'm happy to take questions. And this study is going to be published in the Berkeley Journal of Criminal Law sometime in the spring. A working paper version of it is available on the RAND website for anyone who's interested.
Thank you, Mr. Anderson. So we've got a number of questions in the chat. Several people have asked about the presentation, whether it would be recorded and available at a later date. And the answer is yes, it's being recorded. And I believe we have everyone's email address from when they entered the event. So I believe we can send a link to the recording to those that registered. Is that correct, Dave? All right, thank you. First quick question for Dr. Doliak. Do you have a publication we can refer to for this compelling data and impact?
Yes, so the paper that I presented is published in, or is forthcoming in the American Economic Journal of Applied Economics. There are links on my website. You go to jenniferdoliak.com. I've got both a link to that journal article and a link to the preprint that is ungated that you can download there, as well as links to my earlier work in the U.S.
Thank you. The next question is for Dr. Doliak as well. What was the turnaround time for the DNA database in Denmark? I'm curious if they have similar wait times for U.S. investigators when it comes to getting a DNA hit confirmation.
Yeah, good question. So, so investigators in Denmark are told to expect to wait about 3 weeks for DNA from crime scene evidence to be analyzed. So we exploit that in various ways in the paper, but that is, you know, it might take longer in some cases, might take a little bit less in some special cases, but for the most part, the turnaround time in Denmark seems to be around 3 weeks. I'm not sure what the current numbers are in the US.
Thank you. Dr. Speaker, are there any return on investment studies on trace evidence or any plans on doing an ROI study on trace evidence?
We haven't done any looking at trace, and one of the keys that we found here is that there's been a big reduction in trace analysis that's happened certainly over the past decade. And I think as you see more of the rise in the use of DNA analysis, trace is just a lot more expensive. And I think based on the limited resources, what we're seeing is even though they may have good trace evidence available, kind of deferring to DNA to be able to discover things. Now, it's not that DNA is going to solve everything, but we've done a little bit on comparison of, say, the cost in one area versus another. So dealing with trace evidence in one case might mean that you forego fingerprint identification analysis, I think, in like 18 cases. So it's kind of weighing those kinds of trade-offs, but no particular ROI has been done yet.
Thank you. Next question for Mr. Anderson. The relevance of forensic science clearly driven by the phase of the case. What's relevant at the investigative stage altogether different potentially than the litigative phase? Also, we tend to talk about forensic science in the context of a specific crime and the analysis being used in response to that crime. What else could it do from an intelligence perspective in preventing crimes from occurring in the first place?
Boy, those are both good questions. I think sort of consistent with Dr. Doliak's presentation and finding, right? So the the use of DNA evidence is I think suggests that there are potentially systemic deterrent effects of that that could be relevant. I also think that in some cases forensic evidence could be used to potentially understand broader questions about how crime occurs, even absent a specific criminal defendant or a specific suspect. So again, it could be used as kind of a systems-wide tool. But I'm not 100% sure if I'm answering the question squarely.
Thank you. We'll see if we get a follow-up question.
Okay, get a follow-up.
For Mr. Anderson as well. For fee-based laboratories, could higher productivity be due to contributors better screening their evidence, therefore less evidence is submitted for exam, therefore labs are more productive with their cases?
Yeah, I think that might be an explanation. I mean, I think it's a potentially more efficient triage mechanism. So that various requesting agencies, prioritize evidence in a way, and are less likely to potentially just send everything. I also did, in response to another comment about that finding, I did want to make it clear that was not just based on our 5 sites, but was based on the national census of forensic labs. So it's not perfect, but it's a much larger sample of forensic labs on which we base that finding.
All right, thank you. And I think we heard that the person that asked the prior question was satisfied with your answer, so thank you. Next question for Dr. Doliak, and this is a long one, and I think maybe possibly with several parts, so bear with me. If eligibility for DNA testing is having been charged with a crime that carries at least a 1.5-year sentence, how would data on recidivism within 1 year of the original charge be useful? Many, if not most, subjects would likely still be incarcerated at that point, eliminating them from being able to commit crimes other than the crimes committed while still in custody against the state or other inmates. Wouldn't it make more sense to look at recidivism within a period after release from custody as opposed to from the date of the original charge?
Yep, great question. So because it's just a charge and not a conviction, a lot of these folks won't wind up being convicted or might wind up being sentenced for a lot less than 1.5 years. It is the reason that we look, 1 year out, 2 years out, 3 years out, and see pretty similar results after 3 years. The main reason that it's important to start the clock at the time of the charge rather than the time at release is because the timing of release could be a function of what the parole board or whoever else thinks is your likelihood of reoffending. And so if you commit more to your rehabilitation because you're in the DNA database, you might wind up getting out earlier on good behavior, and so that could wind up confounding the effects if we were to start the clock at the time that you're released. But for the reason you're describing, I think it's important to look, be able to see similar results 3 years out, and we do.
Thank you. Dr. Speaker, can you use the productivity curve that you showed to determine if your lab might be too efficient, such as the scandals that Mr. Anderson noted, referring to dry labbing, etc.?
We've actually made that argument that if a laboratory was looking, so in the case, you look at the state of Massachusetts, which had a couple big cases, and the one out of Boston on dry labbing, by putting this, and some labs have done this where they measure on a going basis, just put it on a dashboard, the productivity. And so if you find somebody that is suddenly 10 times more productive than the average, that looks suspicious. So yes, you can very easily use something like this. We had mentioned Foresight 2020 as a project, and part of what that did was it extracted data from your LIMS system, not only to be able to fill out reports to us or to funding agencies, but it gave a real-time dashboard for the management of things, we'd be able to look at items such as that. One of the best applications of this that I've seen was when I visited the Houston's Forensic Science Center, and noticing that every manager in the lab had that dashboard up at all times. So you could certainly get a sense if you had a problem, such as James had suggested, you could see that.
Thank you. Next question for Mr. Anderson. It would seem that investigative protocols drive forensic use. Was any investigation made to determine if the use of forensic evidence was mandated by written protocols or driven by local circumstances?
Yeah, that's a great question. We didn't we didn't really get into that, and in most cases, right? So the investigative protocols would have governed the collection of the evidence. In most cases, it didn't govern the actual testing, at least in those jurisdictions during that period. So that it really, there was an enormous amount of case by case discretion on the testing aspect of it.
All right, thank you. Another question for Mr. Anderson. What kind of crimes were in the 1,000 cases, and why did you look at cases that were over 10 years old?
Well, we actually started this project in 2012, I think it is. Maybe it was 2013. So at the time, they were the most recent cases that we could get. We were also a little concerned about sort of right-hand censoring. So in other words, we wanted, a key part of our design was to see what the outcome of the forensic science was on the outcome of the cases. And so we needed to have some time built in for them to proceed through the criminal justice system and make it to sentencing. So, and there was another part of the question. So that was, why did we use older cases? And then, what kinds of cases, right? So we used, let's see, it was burglary, robbery, aggravated assault, homicide, and rape were the 5 categories of cases we used.
Thank you. I think this is the last question. I think this will probably be directed at Dr. Dolak or Dr. Speaker. For those countries that don't have a convicted offender database, would the potential cost savings from prevented crime help pay for expanded operation of a DNA section?
Yeah, so in my US paper, I also look at the effects of expanding the DNA databases at the state level on crime rates and do kind of a back of the envelope calculation of the social cost savings and just the prevented crime. And it is, so if a place already has a DNA database and has the kind of infrastructure in terms of labs, expanding the database is absolutely cost effective. The question of how long it would take to pay down those initial fixed costs is something I can't speak directly to, but my hunch is yes, because crime is just so expensive and we are seeing such big reductions in the crime rates, including violent crime. But I don't have specific numbers for you on that.
Yeah, we've seen a little bit of that with the Foresight data, and Dr. Dolak is correct that it ramps up very, very quickly. So the cost once you really kind of get into it, into any, at least of our statewide jurisdictions, the payback is almost immediate.
All right, thank you. We have one related question that just came in that I'm not sure if this is really the best question for our panel, but I'll ask it anyway. for a country without an established efficient DNA database, how to start, how long to train and procure equipment needed. Any takers on that? If not, they can reach out to myself or Brittany, and we'll see if we can respond. There's a lot to that question. All right.
I mean,
I'll
say that.
Okay.
Oh yeah, I can. I mean, I'll just say that I think that's it's the right question, right? I'm not in a good position to provide any of the details, and I think I'm glad that Mark jumped in and offered to do so. But at least based on our findings, and this is a limitation of our study, is that it is a lot of the cases are 10 years old. That with the sort of increased use of sort of rapid turnaround DNA testing, I'm sort of cautiously optimistic that if we did this study tomorrow, we'd get more positive findings in terms of the use of DNA, and obviously Dr. Doliak's findings about the efficacy and the deterrent effects of a DNA database are also encouraging.
Right. Well, thank you to our panelists. It was really informative, and we had a number of questions about whether it was going to be recorded, and people saying they couldn't write notes fast enough. So excellent job. And thank you everyone for your time, and have a wonderful day and stay healthy, please. Thank you.